My Lords, the noble Lord Balfe began this debate by saying he hoped it would not become party political. And I would agree with him in that although the geography of this place divides us into two sides, there is actually more than two sides in British politics. And I will say that this problem is much broader than one side of government, although I'd very much agree with what the noble Lord Hastings just said. Things have got much worse in the past decade. Nonetheless, I think we've spoken a great deal about golden visas, and I would point out that golden visas were introduced in 2008. There was what's known as the blind faith period, when checks on applicants and the source of their wealth were done neither by the banks or the British government, and over 3,000 people came in that period between 2008 and 2015. Now, we have to say that responsibility for that sits on both sides if we divide the House that way of your Lordship's House. This is not a two-party issue, it's a systems issue. We have a broken system here and around the world. Now, I want to thank the noble Lord Brown for introducing this debate so powerfully and indeed giving this chance for such an interesting discussion. And in his introduction, he focused on the financial sector, a haven for dirty money, reputations and laundered, political donations accepted. And I'm really pleased to see the turnout today and contrast it to the kind of turnout we saw in debates on the Financial Services Bill, when frequently we were debating controls on the financial sector, controlling legislation, and there was lucky to be half the number of people there are in this chamber today involved in those debates. And I note that in the second reading of the Financial Services Bill, Lord Agnew of Alton said, "We need to show the rest of the world that this will be a soundly regulated environment." We know how the noble Lord thought that went along. Now, my second point is the noble Lord Howe talked about two economic systems lined up against each other. Well, of course, the world only has one economic system now, capitalism. And I'm not a Marxist. I don't believe that the superstructure is determined by the base. And that's very clear in terms of we have a base of capitalism and we have the structure around the world we have now. And if we look at that, not philosophically but practically, the Russian model was developed on the basis of advice from US and UK advisors, the kleptocratic model. The Chinese adopted the capitalist market system underneath their own political frame. So where we are today is not a degradation, but a continuation. And I have to say that the noble Lord Griffiths' incredibly powerful speech just spilt this out so beautifully. Power and resources have, from the colonial period through the post-colonial period to today, been held in the hands of the few at the impoverishment of the many. We've treated nature as a mine and a dumping ground. And today, to bring it up to the current day, not all of the super yachts being built today and sailed around the world are sailed by kleptocrats and autocrats. Quite a lot of them are people, residents, home of our own countries. Now, the fourth point is about this question of them and us. The authoritarian tendencies that we see in other parts of the world are actually to be found right here at home as well. What are typically described as liberal democracies are neither liberal nor democracies. If we look at the treatment of minoritised communities, and indeed women, by our police forces, if we look at the treatment of desperate refugees by the Home Office hostile environment, that cannot be described as anything but authoritarian. I quote the late feminist social theorist Bell Hooks, "We live in a white suprematist capitalist patriarchy." Yes. This is a system that benefits the few and represses the many. Now, the noble Lord Howe said that systems are not delivering and perhaps we should look to Asia and other places. Well, I would suggest we should instead look to the ignored people in our own societies, the people who are repressed, oppressed, dispossessed in our own societies, but who are building up from the grassroots up alternatives and different ways of doing things. And if we actually look at the global frame of freedom and liberty, where do the ideas come from if we go back to the human rights framework, that was very much driven by campaigning from civil society that forced the introduction of those things that built up towards the UN and the human rights framework. More recently, we look at Medinsky-style sanctions. Where do they come from? They come from civil rights campaigning that were then implemented by government. So, my lords, I want to conclude by saying we are responsible for the state of the world today. To prevent a world dominated by autocrats, kleptocrats and populists, here and abroad, don't look outside, look inside.